tails. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected together with a chain whose bites swung between them, rhythmically clinking. Another report from the cliff made me think suddenly of that ship of war I'd seen firing into a continent. It was the same kind of ominous voice, but these men could by no stretch of imagination be called enemies. They were called criminals, and the outraged law, like the bursting shells, had come to them, an insoluble mystery from the sea. All their meager breasts panted together. The violently dilated nostrils quivered. The eyes stared stonily uphill. They passed me within 6 inches, without a glance, with that complete death-like indifference of unhappy savages. Behind us, raw matter, one of the reclaimed, the product of the new forces at work, strolled despondently, carrying a rifle by its middle. He had a uniform jacket with one button off. The eye of detail for Conrad is amazing through Marlowe. And seeing a white man on the path, hoisted his weapon to his shoulder with alacrity. This was simple prudence, white men being so much alike at a distance that he could not tell who I might be. He was speedily reassured, and with a large, white, rascally grin and a glance at his charge, seemed to take me into partnership in his exalted trust. After all, I also was a part of the great cause of these high and just proceedings. These high and just proceedings clearly sounding very much like Swift or Poe in the level of satire, or we might say Chaucer for that matter, the satire. Instead of going up, we call this now the passage, the Grove scene, maybe the most famous passage of Heart of Darkness. Instead of going up, I turned and descended to the left. My idea was to let that chain gang get out of sight before I climbed the hill. You know, I'm not particularly tender. I've had to strike and to fend off. I've had to resist and to attack sometimes. That's only one way of resisting without counting the exact cost according to the demands of such sort of life as I had blundered into. I've seen the devil of violence and the devil of greed and the devil of hot desire, but by all these stars, these were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men. Men, I tell you. But as I stood on this hillside, I foresaw that in the blinding sunshine of that land, I would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly. How insidious he could be too, I was only to find out several months later and 1,000 miles further. For a moment, I stood appalled, as though by warning. Finally, I descended the hill obliquely towards the trees I had seen. I avoided a vast artificial hole somebody had been digging on the slope, the purpose of which I found it impossible to divine. It wasn't a quarry or a sandpit anyhow. It was just a hole. It might have been connected with the philanthropic desire of giving the criminals something to do. I don't know. Then I nearly fell into a very narrow ravine, almost no more than a scar in the hillside. I discovered that a lot of imported drainage pipes for the settlement had been tumbled in there. There wasn't one that was not broken. It was a wanton smash-up. At last, I got under the trees. My purpose was to stroll into the shade for a moment, but then no sooner within than it seemed to me that I had stepped into the gloomy circle of some inferno. By the way, inferno, you're reading it with me now, but inferno is capitalized here. The rapids were near, and an uninterrupted, uniform, headlong, rushing noise filled the mournful stillness of the grove, where not a breath stirred, not a leaf moved with a mysterious sound, as though the tearing pace of the launched earth had suddenly become audible. Black shapes crouched, lay, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. Another mine on the cliff went off, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under my feet. The work was going on. The work. And this was the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. They were dying slowly. It was very clear. They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now. Nothing. But black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. brought from all the recesses of the coast and all the legality of time contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed on unfamiliar food, they sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and rest. These moribund shapes were free as air and nearly as thin. I began to distinguish the gleam of the eyes under the trees. Then, glancing down, I saw a face near my hand. The black bones reclined at full length with one shoulder against the tree, and slowly the eyelids rose and the sunken eyes looked up at me, enormous and vacant, a kind of blind white flicker in the depths of the orbs which died out slowly. The man seemed young, almost a boy, but you know, with them it's hard to tell. Note the irony of that. With them it's hard to tell. Note the irony. Earlier he said that the white man recognized there was a white man in front of him, but he didn't know who it was because out here they all looked the same. The ironies abound in this passage. I found nothing else to do but to offer him, this one who's come up, offer him one of my good sweet ship's biscuits I had in my pocket. The fingers closed slowly on it and held. There was no other movement and no other glance. He had tied a bit of white worsted string around his neck. Why? Where did he get it? Was it a badge, an ornament, a charm, a propitiatory act? Was there any idea at all connected with it? It looked startling round his black neck, this bit of white thread from beyond the seas. Near the same tree, two more bundles of acute ankles sat with their legs drawn up, one with his chin propped on his knees, stared at nothing in an intolerable and appalling manner. His brother phantom rested his forehead as if overcome with a great weariness, and all about others were scattered in every pose of contorted collapse, as in some picture of a massacre or a pestilence. While I stood, horror-struck, note the line, we'll come back to it, Kurtz's final word will be the horror of the horror. While I stood horror-struck, one of these creatures rose to his hands and knees and went off on all fours towards the river to drink. He lapped out of his hand, then sat up in the sunlight, crossing his shins in front of him, and after a time let his woolly head fall on his breastbone. Well, there are a few passages that I can read to you guys in 303 that speak to the harshness, to the vulgarity of this notion of imperialism. And when we study Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, our comments on LearnStrong.net in the Senior B folder, the AP folder, we're going to have some similar kinds of recognitions, but here notice Conrad, he's not saying a whole lot other than telling us just what it is that Marlowe sees. That's it. Nobody steps in to make any kind of authoritarian kind of editorial comment. This is what it was. Very much like Dante describing those poor phantoms in Inferno. Well, this cruelty, this squalor of imperial enterprise, obviously will contrast sharply with the jungle, the majestic jungle that surrounds the settlements, right, and continues to encroach in, almost making them appear like tiny islands in the middle of a huge, vast darkness. Marlowe does finally arrive at the central station run by the general manager, this nasty, unwholesome kind of conspiratorial character. He finds his steamship has been sunk, so he's got to spend several months waiting for parts to repair it. And as he's doing so, we begin to hear that the reason he's going into the heart of Africa, the continent, the Congo, is to find this Kurtz character who grows in his imagination during this period. The manager and his favorite, the brickmaker, seem to almost like fear Kurtz because he's almost like a threat to their position. Kurtz is rumored to be ill, making the delays in repairing the ships all the more costly. Marlowe eventually gets the parts, needs to repair a ship, and he and the manager set out with a few agents, who, by the way, Marlowe will call pilgrims because of their strange habit of carrying long wooden staves wherever they go. We have a few cannibals on this long and difficult voyage now up the river. The dense jungle, the oppressive silence makes everybody aboard a little bit concerned, a little bit weary, very jumpy. The occasional glimpse of a native village, the sound of drums kind of upsets these pilgrims, obviously. Marlowe and his crew come across a hut with some stacked firewood, together with a note saying that the wood's for them, they should approach carefully and cautiously. Shortly after the steamer's taken on the firewood, it's surrounded by a dense fog. And again, we go back to Shakespeare's Macbeth, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. And we recognize we are in the fog and filthy air, right? And the language in the book itself, I mean, is so dense to read. And then when the fog clears, the ship is attacked. These unseen band of natives, they fire arrows, you know, obviously from the side out of the woods. And the African helmsman is killed before Marlowe can frighten the natives away with the steam's whistle, the ship's whistle. Not long after this, Marlowe and his companions will arrive at the inner station, which is Kurtz's inner station, expecting to find him dead, but instead they find this crazy Russian trader who meets them as they come ashore, and he assures them everything is fine, and he tells them he's the one who left the wood. The Russian claims Kurtz has enlarged his mind. He keeps talking about Kurtz in this really strange, like, hero worship type of thing. And he can't be subjected to the same moral judgments as normal people. Now, what Kurtz has done is what we call gone native, okay? He's a European who has arrived in the heart of Africa, and he's kind of established himself there as a god with the natives. He's gone on these brutal raids in the surrounding territory in search of ivory, okay? And we've got heads that have all been cut off and stuck on posts, and they're all facing in directions that have made all of us who read this kind of muse on every single thing that it seems Conrad does in this book has some kind of symbolism, right? Obviously, this is his method, right, of education. The pilgrims will bring Kurtz out of the station house on a stretcher. A large group of native warriors will pour out of the forest and surround them. And then Kurtz will finally speak. And then the natives will disappear into the woods. The manager will bring Kurtz, who's very ill and soon to die, aboard the steamer. And then we have this beautiful native woman, right? Apparently Kurtz's mistress, we might say, who appears on the shore and stares out at the ship. The Russian suggests that she is somehow involved with Kurtz and has probably caused quite a bit of trouble through her influence maybe over him. The Russian then will reveal to Marlowe, after swearing him to secrecy, that Kurtz ordered the attack on the steamer to make them believe that he was dead in order that they might turn back and leave him to whatever it is that are his plans. Then the Russian will leave by canoe, fearing of, obviously, the wrath of the manager. Kurtz disappears in the night. Marlowe goes out in search of him and finds him crawling on all fours toward the native camp. And this will be an epiphany for Marlowe, who has built Kurtz up in his mind as this crazy genius guy, and yet here he is, like an animal crawling in the middle of the jungle in the middle of the night. Marlowe will stop him and convince him to return to the ship, and then they start off down the river the next morning. But clearly Kurtz is dying. Marlowe will listen to Kurtz talk while he pilots the ship, and Kurtz will then share some important information with Marlowe, as well as a packet of personal documentation. An eloquent pamphlet on civilizing the savages, which ends with the scrawled message that says, "Exterminate all the brutes." The steamer's going to break down. They have to stop for repairs, and it's at this point that we then come to the pivotal part of the novel and the last words of Kurtz. This to me is compelling stuff, so I'll try and share it with you. One evening, coming in with a candle, I was startled to hear Kurtz say a little tremulously, "I'm lying here in the dark, waiting for death." The light was within a foot of his eyes. I forced myself to murmur, "Oh, nonsense," and stood over him as if transfixed. This mesmerizing kind of language is a key part of our novella. Anything approaching the change that came over his features, I have never seen before and hope to never see again. Oh, I wasn't touched. I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. We think of the New Testament and the crucifixion of Christ. I saw on that ivory face the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender? during that supreme moment of complete knowledge. Now, go back to our comments that we made at the end of our study of Goethe's Faust and Nietzsche's eternal reoccurrence. Notice this question here about, did he live his life again? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. Final words of Kurtz. I blew the candle out and left the cabin. The pilgrims were dining in the mess room, and I took my place opposite the manager, who lifted his eyes to give me a questioning glance, which I successfully ignored. He leaned back serene, with that peculiar smile of his sealing the unexpected depths of his meanness. A continuous shower of small flies streamed about the lamp, upon the cloth, upon our hands and faces. We'll think of Golding's Lord of Flies. Suddenly, the manager's boy put his insolent black head in the doorway and said in a tone of scathing contempt, "Mr. Kurtz, he dead." Here, of course, the words that are quoted by T.S. Eliot at the beginning of Halloween. All the pilgrims rushed out to see. I remained and went on with my dinner. I believe I was considered brutally callous. However, I did not eat much. There was a lamp in there. Light, don't you know? And outside it was so beastly dark. I went no more near the remarkable man who had pronounced a judgment upon the adventures of his soul on this earth. The voice was gone. What else had been there? But I am, of course, aware that next day the pilgrims buried something in a muddy hole. By the way, this thing about the voice being gone, what else is there? Understand that Marlowe is speaking all of these words in total darkness, so that the one telling us about Marlowe's words says, we never really got to see him much, with the occasion probably of a lit match or something every once in a while. And then they were very nearly buried me. However, as you see, now Marlowe's going to finish his story, I did not go to join Kurtz there and then. I did not. I remained to dream the nightmare out to the end and to show my loyalty to Kurtz once more. Destiny, my destiny, droll thing life is, that mysterious arrangement of merciless logic for a futile purpose. We think of Macbeth's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. We think of Faulkner's Sound and Fury, don't we? The most you can hope for, the most you can hope from it, is some knowledge of yourself that comes too late. Epistemology. A crop of unextinguishable regrets. I've wrestled with death. It's the most unexciting contest you can imagine. It takes place in an impalpable grayness, with nothing underfoot, with nothing around, with spectators, without clamor, without glory, without the great desire of victory, without the great fear of defeat. In a sickly atmosphere of tepid skepticism, without much belief in your own right, still less in that of your adversary. If such is the form of ultimate wisdom, then life is a greater riddle than some of us think it to be. I was within a hair's breadth of the last opportunity for pronouncement, and I found with humiliation that probably I would have nothing to say. This is the reason why I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. The horror, obviously. He said it. Since I had peered over the edge myself, I understand better the meaning of his stare that could not see the flame of the candle, that was wide enough to embrace the whole universe, piercing enough to penetrate all the hearts that beat in the darkness. He had summed up, he had judged the horror. He was a remarkable man, after all. This was the expression of some sort of belief. It had candor, it had conviction, it had a vibrating note of revolt in its whisper. It had the appalling face of a glimpsed truth, the strange commingling of desire and hate. And it is not my own extremity I remember best. A vision of grayness without form, filled with physical pain and a careless contempt for the effervescence of all things, even of this pain itself. No, it is his extremity that I seem to have lived through. True, he had made that last stride. He had stepped over the edge while I had been permitted to draw back my hesitating foot. And perhaps in this is the whole difference. Perhaps all the wisdom and all the truth and all the sincerity are just compressed into that inappreciable moment of time in which we step over the threshold of the invisible, perhaps. I like to think my summing up would not have been a word of careless contempt. Better, his cry, much better. It was an affirmation, a moral victory, paid for by innumerable defeats, by abominable terrors, by abominable satisfactions, but it was victory. That is why I have remained loyal to Kurtz to the last, and even beyond, when a long time after I heard once more not his own voice, but the echo of his magnificent eloquence thrown to me from a soul as translucently pure as a cliff of crystal. Quickly, Marlowe falls sick, almost dies himself. Eventually, he makes it back to Europe, and he goes as his final act of loyalty to Kurtz's intended, his fiancée. She's still in mourning, even though it's been over a year. Kurtz has died over a year ago. She's still in mourning, wearing her black, and right away, she will begin to speak about Kurtz and to praise him. The final lines of the novella haunting in their brilliance. Few writers, guys, we read, have the command of the language, and to think, he didn't grow up learning English. His intended will say, suddenly, very low, he died as he lived. His end, said I, with dull anger stirring in me, was in every way worthy of his life. And I was not with him, she murmured. My anger subsided before a feeling of infinite pity. Everything that could be done, I mumbled. But I believed in him more than anyone on earth, more than his own mother, more than himself. He needed me. I would have treasured every sigh, every word, every sign, every